Albert Fish was born on May 19th, 1870, and he was an American serial killer, child rapist, and cannibal. He was also known as the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac, and the Boogeyman. Albert once boasted that he had children in every state, and at one time he stated the number of victims was about 100. However, it is not known whether he was referring to rapes or cannibalization, nor is it known if the statement was truthful. Albert was a suspect in at least 5 murders during his lifetime. Albert confessed to 3 murders that police were able to trace to a known homicide, and he confessed to stabbing at least 2 other people. He was put on trial for the kidnapping and murder of Grace Budd and was convicted and executed by electric chair. Albert Fish was born in Washington, D.C. on May 19th, 1870, to Randall and Ellen Fish. Fish's father was American of English ancestry, and his mother was Scots-Irish American. His father was 43 years older than his mother and 75 years old at the time of his birth. Fish was the youngest child and had 3 living siblings, Walter, Annie, and Edwin. He wished to be known as Albert after a dead sibling and to escape the nickname Ham and Eggs that he was given at an orphanage in which he spent much of his childhood. Albert Fish's family had a history of mental illness. His uncle suffered from mania. A brother was confined in a state mental hospital. His sister was diagnosed with mental affliction. 3 other relatives were diagnosed with mental illnesses, and his mother had visual hallucinations. Albert's father, Randall, was a riverboat captain and by 1870 a fertilizer manufacturer. The elder Fish died in 1875 at Washington 6th Street Station of a heart attack. The Congressional Cemetery records show that he died on October 16th, 1875 and was buried on October 19th, 1875 in grave RN6/89. Fish's mother then put her son into St. John's Orphanage in Washington, where he was frequently abused. He began to enjoy the physical pain and the beatings brought. Of the time at the orphanage, Fish remarked, "I was there till I was nearly 9, and that's where I got started wrong. We were unmercifully whipped. I saw boys doing many things they should not have done." By 1880, his mother had a government job and was able to remove Albert from the orphanage. In 1882, at age 12, he began a relationship with a telegraph boy. The youth introduced Fish to such practices as drinking urine and eating feces. Fish began visiting public bathrooms where he would watch other boys undress and spend a great portion of his weekends on these visits. Throughout his life, he would write obscene letters to women whose names he acquired from classified advertising and matrimonial agencies. By 1890, Albert arrived in New York City, and he said at that point he became a prostitute and began raping young boys. In 1898, his mother arranged a marriage for him with Anne Mary Hoffman, who was 9 years his junior. They had 6 children: Albert, Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry Fish. Throughout 1898, he worked as a house painter. He said he continued molesting children, mostly boys younger than age 6. He later recounted an incident in which a male lover took him to a waxworks museum, where Fish was fascinated by a bisection of a penis. After that, he became obsessed with sexual mutilation. In 1903, he was arrested for grand larceny and was sentenced to incarceration in Sing Sing. Around 1910, while he was working in Wilmington, Delaware, Fish met a 19-year-old man named Thomas Keaton. He took Keaton to where he was staying, and the two began a sadomasochistic relationship. It is unclear whether or not Fish forced Keaton to do these things, but in his confession, he implies that the man was intellectually disabled. After 10 days, Fish took Keaton to an old farmhouse where he began to torture him. The torture took place over 2 weeks. Fish eventually tied Keaton up and cut off half of his penis. I shall never forget his screams or the look he gave me, Fish later recalled. He originally intended to kill Keaton, cut up his body, and take it home, but he feared the hot weather would draw attention to him. Instead, Fish poured peroxide over the wound, wrapped it up in Vaseline with a covered handkerchief, left a $10 bill, kissed Keaton goodbye, and left. He took the first train he could get back home and never heard what became of him or tried to find out, Fish later said. In January 1917, Fish's wife left him for a handyman who boarded with Fish and family. Fish then had to raise his children as a single parent. After his arrest, Fish told a newspaper that when his wife left him, she nearly took every possession the family owned. He began to have hallucinations, and he once wrapped himself in a carpet saying that he was following the instructions of John the Apostle. It was at about this time that Fish began to indulge in self-harm. He would embed needles into his groin and abdomen. After his arrest, x-rays revealed that Fish had at least 29 needles lodged in his pelvic region. He also hit himself repeatedly with a nail-studded paddle and inserted wool doused with lighter fluid into his anus and set it on fire. While he was never thought to have physically attacked or abused his children, he did encourage them and their friends to paddle his butt with the same nail-studded paddle he used to abuse himself. He soon developed a growing obsession with cannibalism after preparing himself a dinner consisting solely of raw meat and sometimes serving it to his children. In about 1919, he stabbed an intellectually disabled boy in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. Fish chose people who were either mentally handicapped or African Americans as his victims, explaining that he assumed these people would not be missed when killed. He would later claim to occasionally pay boys to procure him or other children. Fish tortured, mutilated, and murdered young children with his implements of hell, a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a small handsaw. On June 11, 1924, Fish found 8-year-old Beatrice Kyle playing alone on her parents' Staten Island farm. He offered her money to come and help him look for rhubarb. She was about to leave the farm when her mother chased Fish away. Fish left, but returned later to the Kyle's barn, where he tried to sleep but was discovered by Hans Kyle and forced to leave. During 1924, the 54-year-old Fish was suffering from psychosis and felt that God was commanding him to torture and sexually mutilate children. Shortly before his abduction of Grace Budd, Albert attempted to test his implements of hell on a child he had been molesting named Cyril Quinn. Quinn and his friends were playing box ball on a sidewalk when Fish asked them if they had eaten lunch. When they said they had not, he invited them into his apartment for sandwiches. While the two boys were wrestling on Fish's bed, they dislodged his mattress. Underneath was a knife, a small handsaw, and a meat cleaver. They became frightened and ran out of the apartment. Albert Fish remarried on February 6, 1930 in Waterloo, New York to Estella Wilcox, but divorced after only 1 week. Fish was arrested in May 1930 for sending an obscene letter to a woman who answered an advertisement for a maid. Following that arrest and one in 1931, he was sent to Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital for observation. On May 25, 1928, Fish saw a classified advertisement in the Sunday edition of the New York World that read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." On May 28, 1928, Fish, then 58 years old, visited the Budd family in Manhattan under the pretense of hiring Edward. He later confessed that he planned to tie Edward up, mutilate him, and leave him to bleed to death. He introduced himself as Frank Howard, a former farmer from Farmingdale, New York. Fish promised to hire Bud and his friend Willie and said he would send them for them in a few days. He failed to show up, but he sent a telegraph to the Bud family apologizing and set a later date. When Fish returned, he met Grace Budd. He apparently changed his intended victim from Edward Budd to Grace Budd and quickly made up a story about having to attend his niece's birthday party. He convinced her parents to let her go and accompany him to the party that evening. The elder Albert Budd was a porter for the United States Equitable Life Assurance Society. Grace had a younger sister, Beatrice, two older brothers, Edward and George Budd, and a younger brother, Albert Budd II. Grace left with Fish that day, but she never returned. In November 1934, an anonymous letter was sent to the girl's parents, which ultimately led police to Fish. Mistress Budd was illiterate and could not read the letter herself, so she had her son read it to her. Albert Fish's trial began March 11th, 1935, and he was found to be sane and guilty, and the judge ordered the death sentence. Fish arrived at prison in March 1935 and was executed on January 16th, 1936, in the electric chair at Sing Sing. Albert Fish's last words were, "I don't even know why I'm here." And according to one witness, it took just 2 jolts before Fish died. Albert Fish was buried in the Sing Sing prison cemetery.